this was a small focus of a larger project looking at diversity of elms, and we really wanted to look at beetle behaviour and the performance of some of these disease-resistant elms that have already been planted out in the countryside. And this is some work that I undertook with my colleague Clive Brazier, and I also really want to acknowledge the support and help that we've also had from Andrew Brooks at the East Hampshire Butterfly Conservation organisation, because it's really thanks to some of the work that Andrew Brooks has done planting out these elms that we've been able to look at them and see how they are performing in the field. So we had two really main areas of focus, and one that I briefly touched on then. These trees that have already been planted out, these often resistant elm cultivars, either come from breeding programs or considered to be resistant from the way they perform in the field. And we wanted to look at them under Dutch elm disease pressure and see what their outcomes were. And the other element of the project that I'm going to deal with a little bit later is looking at the presence and the relative frequency of the two bark beetles that act as vectors of the Dutch elm disease pathogen Ophiostoma novoalmi. And I thought, just as a little reminder to everybody, I would just touch on the Dutch elm disease cycle as well. And for the purposes of what I'm talking about today, it's really worthwhile considering the disease cycle in terms of what happens with the healthy elms and then what happens when they're diseased. And really, when it comes to beetle behaviour, the important thing is what goes on with these healthy elms, because when beetles are dispersing, which will be a little later in the year, in April, May, spring, early summer, they emerge from their breeding materials and they disperse and fly. And as they're flying, they have to make pit stops to stop themselves becoming too desiccated. And to do that, they feed in the crowns of healthy elms. And they just feed in the upper part of the crown, in the crotches that are made between twigs that are maybe a couple of years old, 2 or 3 years old, as they are subtended from slightly older twigs. And they chew away the bark. And that's what you can see in that uppermost picture there, that beetle in that feeding twig crotch, and where it's chewed away that bark and expose the xylem, as you can see there. And that is the moment where, if the Dutch elm disease pathogen Ophiostoma novoalmi is carried by that beetle, it can be transferred into that wound, and that's how it gets into the vascular tissue of the tree. And then you get tylosis response from the tree with this streaking or blackened dots that you can see there. And that is as the fungus moves around in the tree and the tree is responding to the fungus. Those beetles don't sort of hang around. This process of feeding is a matter of hours. Sometimes beetles will remain in those feeding grooves for maybe a day or 2 days if the weather isn't very conducive to flight and dispersal. But they will then fly off. And really, it's an unknown quantity what happens, because only a small number of those feeding grooves will actually result in the fungus, the pathogen, gaining access to that xylem. But once it's in that tree, then really the prognosis tends not to be very good for that tree. And then other beetles, while they're dispersing as well, will also be looking for these declining trees to breed in, and they will then invade the bark. And when they go into the bark, if they're still carrying the fungus, they introduce the fungus into that bark, where the beetles will breed. Larvae will develop into a new brood of beetles, which eventually emerge the following year. And while they're in that bark, they will pick up the fungus as well. So this process of feeding, which isn't obligatory for these bark beetles, is really an unfortunate side event which can allow the trees to become diseased. So when we're thinking about, well, how are these resistant elms performing under Dutch elm disease pressure? the way we approached it was to try and quantify the amount of feeding by these beetles on individual trees in the field. And what you can see in that right-hand picture down the side of that slide, I don't know if I move my cursor, you can see here is where a beetle has chewed away that bark and made a feeding groove or a feeding wound, and that has started to callus over. But you can get all these potential feeding positions, count where they are, and look to see the number where there are signs of feeding going on. So we did this with trees in the field, and our other way of looking at the performance of resistant elms was to try and find out where there were any records that people had of when trees had become resistant trees had become infected by Dutch elm disease, and try and get an idea of the number of trees and how extensive the symptoms were. So, working particularly with Andrew Brooks here, we focus pretty much on one side. And as you can see, there's quite a range of different elms that come from different research, different breeding programs really around the world, but mainly Europe and some from North America. But our initial problems when trying to do this work were having enough of different sorts of elm trees so we could make comparisons. So at the end of the day, we focused on feeding behaviour of the beetles on one clone of Ulmus minor, Adamus, which has relatively recently been released from a Spanish breeding program. And these Ulmus minor are similar to the sort of clones of elms that we would see in the countryside here in Britain. And we also looked at the beetle feeding on that, and also Ulmus laevis, which is European white elm, which has been promoted very much over the past few years of an elm to plant and an elm to think about because of the way it seems to perform in the field. And very often you will find people will tell you that it is resistant. And so what we tried to do was find trees that were growing in close proximity, an adamus and a laevis. So the assumption could be that they were really exposed to similar numbers of beetles dispersing and potentially feeding on them, and then look to see if there were any similarities or differences in that feeding. And we tried to do this at different distances away from beetle sources, because as beetles emerge and fly, they fly towards the light, and their numbers will gradually be diluted over larger and larger distances. So this just gives you a little glimpse of some of the results that we were getting. And the blue bars are the Ulmus laevis, and the orange bars are the Ulmus adamus. So the Ulmus laevis versus the Ulmus minor. And what we're seeing usually with the bars on the left-hand side of the graph is where they're quite distant from a beetle source, and then usually with the taller bars where they're closer to a beetle source. And so one of the first things that we noticed was that, generally speaking, where we were comparing the Ulmus laevis with the Ulmus minor, the adamus, the beetles preferred to feed on the adamus, the Ulmus minor, much more than the Ulmus laevis. And that's consistent with what other people have shown and noticed in the field. And that seems to be one of the reasons why Ulmus laevis seems to be able to perform well in the field where there is some Dutch elm disease around. But what we found was, once the trees were exposed to a source of beetles that were very close by, then really that difference in their preference to feed on the field elm over the white elm became really quite not really noticeable. And you can see that, for example, with graph C here, and we're looking at three types of trees here, a laevis here, and then an adamus, and then this is vada, another resistant elm, and the amount of feeding on the three of them is about the same, and they're very close to a beetle source. Whereas if you're looking at beetles that are more coming from a more distant source, and you're comparing between, say, adamus and laevis, which is on the left-hand side, you tend to get this differential. So usually laevis is less preferred for feeding, but that preference to go for a field elm over a laevis tends to become blurred once the beetles are very close by. So what we found when we are looking at these paired trees, what I've already said, that the extent of beetle breeding depends on the distance from a beetle source. Also the weather, we have periods where the weather was very conducive to beetle flight, it synchronized it, and you would get a lot of beetle feeding going on, and of both beetle species, Scolytus scolytus and Scolytus multistriatus. Usually the lavis was less preferred to feed on, but even elms that tend to be less attracted to the beetles for feeding can end up with heavy feeding when those beetle populations spike up. But one of the things that was most interesting was, whereas we saw with the resistant elms, Adamus and Vada, that have been released from elm breeding programs and challenged over that process of breeding with the Dutch elm disease pathogen, they never developed any external symptoms despite very heavy feeding, particularly in 2022 and 2023. But we did see, intriguingly, with Adamus, this almost minor clone that is resistant, never developed any external symptoms, but that didn't mean it didn't become infected. We could see signs of tylosis and streaking in the xylem vessels. So it did become infected, but it seemed to be tolerant of that infection and didn't develop symptoms. This really was in contrast with lavis, which when the amount of feeding on Ulmus lavis began to increase, we did see dying Ulmus lavis trees, and then they became used for breeding by the beetles, and that added to the number of beetle sources as well. So just turning to this counterpoint of looking at the performance of resistant elm cultivars as reported to us, or where we could find records, we did find some records of some elms considered to be resistant that had often come from breeding programs. And in some cases, they would develop some defoliation, and then they would usually, most often, recover the following year. Although we did have a couple of trees, for example, Retiro and Christina Buisman, which is quite an old release from a breeding program, that did go on to develop a lot of defoliation and either had to be dyed later on or had to be removed. And also with this resistant version of Ulmus americana, Princetown as well. So we do see some failures in some of these resistant elm cultivars that have been released from some of these breeding programs, but by and large, even if they become infected, they usually recover, and the infection is quite minor. So they're not immune. Quite a lot of them can become infected, probably when there are large numbers of beetles around feeding, but for the most part, they recover. So I want to turn a little more about beetle feeding and Ulmus lavis. And this is really all about the performance of Ulmus lavis and these Ulmus lavis trees that are being planted on some of these butterfly conservation sites. And we were lucky enough to be able to look at about 50 of these Ulmus lavis planted out because of their field performance, some of them about 20 years old now, across a number of different sites. Here's one that has, as you can see, died of the disease, and in fact, the bark has been used for beetle breeding. And these trees had performed very well year after year until we came to about 2022 and 2023, when we've had good summers, a lot of beetle emergence going on, and then we've seen the failure of this particular species of elm tree, Ulmus lavis, succumbing to Dutch elm disease. So performance in the field, the fact that the beetles usually don't like to feed on it, is not sustaining it over the longer term when beetle numbers really start to increase in some areas. And as you can see, out of this total of 50 Ulmus lavis, by the time we got to 2024, something like approaching 70% of them had become diseased or had died of disease. So I think that really put it in perspective that if you want to be sure of the performance of your elm, you have to have it from really a consistent and reputable breeding program, and not really rely on trees that have performed well in the field and assume that they are resistant, because that isn't necessarily the case. Now, I want to touch on fairly briefly the other part of this project, and that was establish the presence and the relative frequency of the two vector beetles, Scolytus scolytus and Scolytus multistriatus. And we did this quite simply by going and visiting a series of sites across southern England, from Devon right through to Sussex, and quantifying the extent of beetle breeding that we could see in those trees as they succumbed to the disease, what species it was, and what impact they were having. And I'm going to show you some of the information that came from two sites where we were able to take quite a close look at quite a good number of trees at each site, between 40 and 80 trees at each site, and look in some detail at the beetle breeding. And I suppose one of the things that was sort of maybe mildly surprising was we very much see these peaks and troughs in disease striking, for example, hedgerow trees. And usually it's thought that the trees get to 15 or 20 years old before they succumb. And that usually is the case. And we do see, for example, that they usually, you don't get a local epidemic building up until the trees are big enough and have thick enough bark to sustain breeding beetles. But when we looked at the size class of the elms, and this is just the elms from the two different sites, one in Devon and one in Hampshire, what we found was, although we got quite a large number of trees, for example, that had a stem diameter of 20 centimetres or less, we also got some that were well over 40 centimetres in stem diameter, even over 50 centimetres in stem diameter. So some of these trees are surviving quite considerable amounts of time, well beyond the 15 or 20 years that usually considered the norm. And so when they do succumb, they can sustain quite a lot of beetle breeding as well. But I'm just going to really touch on this in more generalities. But where we measured those trees, usually we found both the bark beetles. I think at all sites we found both bark beetles, Scolytus scolytus and Scolytus multistriatus. And that's an interesting observation, and that Scolytus scolytus is by far the better, the more effective vector compared with Scolytus multistriatus. So the suggestion was that as trees haven't been reaching this larger size, that the epidemic that we have now of Dutch elm disease is really dependent on multistriatus. And that really isn't the case. We're finding both of them, but usually the trees have to be at least 20 centimetres diameter before we're seeing Scolytus scolytus really starting to breed in any numbers. And the other thing is, as you watch the epidemic develop over a number of years, these small local epidemics on hedgerow trees or on the edge of woodlands, initially you will get trees being killed. Often they're some of the largest trees being killed, but they're often not found later on by beetles to breed in. So some of these local epidemics get off to quite a stuttering start. So very often it is only with Scolytus multistriatus, and then gradually you get more and more breeding, the trees being used more efficiently for breeding, as you get beetles that have been able to establish in those trees on that site, then just flying short distances to infect and breed in others. And in those early stages, though, many trees die with little or no breeding. So they're being found by, if you like, immigrant beetles that are coming from outbreaks further away. It's very much a hit or miss effect. Some become infected, most don't. And then there's very much a hit or miss effect of whether they're then found for beetle breeding and how quickly beetle numbers then tend to build up in those areas. So still ongoing. Well, we're analysing some of these data just to get a better handle on these Scolytus multistriatus ratios, but we're currently writing up a research paper, and we're particularly going to focus on Ulmus laevis as a cautionary tale, which also has relevance to wych elm as well, which performs well in the field but is very susceptible to the pathogen, but the beetles tend to avoid it when feeding, but that doesn't mean it has a long-term sustainable or individual trees don't have a long-term sustainable future. Even if the beetles tend to avoid feeding on them, if that is the only tree they can find to feed on, or beetle numbers build up, then I think the same thing that we saw with laevis will happen with Ulmus glabra. And we're going to try and focus a bit more on performance of the disease-resistant elms and see if we can find some more records on where they failed or where they haven't failed. And one thing that we hope to do is look to see how we may have an increasing number of days that are suitable for beetle flight as our climate is warming up, particularly with warmer springs and summer, particularly in Scotland, how that may also be driving the disease in some parts of Britain. And I think that takes me on to my last slide. And I just want to say, really, a lot of the work that we've done in the field looking at these resistant elms, we couldn't have done without the help of Andrew Brooks as well. So thank you.